Welcome back, and thank you for joining me for this second video. And thank you for all the comments and views and positive feedback on my first video. And I'm glad that it could benefit many of you. Sometimes, you do research and you don't have the opportunity to spread it with a general population. So I'm very happy to have this opportunity to share this information with you. Now, the topic that I'm going to be talking about today is research that I conducted in 2017 with Syrian refugees throughout Europe. And my main research question was, why did Syrians go to Europe by extra-legal means? Now, this may be a very seemingly simple question that requires a very simple answer and a very apparent answer. But the nice thing about sociology is that when you begin your research, what might seem like a very apparent answer to a general population doesn't always turn out that way. Because like the population that you're surveying, their answers can be very diverse, and themes and topics come up that as a researcher you wouldn't think of, or even as someone who's Syrian or someone who traveled themselves to Europe during that time period wouldn't have thought. And the reason why I feel this type of research is important is, one, to capture the voices of Syrian refugees, for two, the policymakers to have this tool of to allow them to draft policy that is more relevant and viable to and for the people that they're drafting it for. Because until you ask these types of questions, you really don't have the data to state, well, they came because of this or they came because of that, and would influence their decision to travel by extra legal means was influenced by this or that. Now, this study is very small. I'm not sure how much of this I can get through in 10, 12 minutes, but I do have a study brief published from a university in Australia, and the link will be there in the comments. Now, the study itself, it looks at many aspects of why a Syrian would come to Europe by extra legal means, and the foundation of my research was based largely on this book, The Ambiguities of Domination by Lisa Wedin. Now, what she does is she looks at the effects of authoritative rule on Syrian society. And the topic of my study is broken promises, historic authoritative rule, and selective enforcement of international law, fueling the surge in human trafficking in the case of Syria. Now, what does seeking asylum by extralegal means have to do with Syrians' historic exposure to authoritative rule and experience with authoritative rule or international law? Well, what the study did was it looked at how this possibly could have affected their choices. And how I came to this connection was after I was living in the Middle East for about 5 years. Many people, Westerners and non-Westerners, would ask me, okay, Lisa, what's the difference between living in the Middle East and living in the West? And it's a question I thought about very deeply, and I came to the determination that the main difference is enforceable laws. The hallmark of Western democracies is the effectiveness of a legal system, particularly in the United States, in the European Union, this concept of the Geneva Convention, the Constitution, Convention on the Status of Refugees. These are all laws that were supposed to be there to allow refugees to seek asylum in other countries, but this didn't happen. And looking at how law in Syria and in many other developing countries, and yes, too, sometimes in the West, law doesn't always function the way it should. And some people, the law works better for them than others. So when you're faced with a situation where international law is no longer working, and you have the experience from yourself, from your parents, from your grandparents, that when the law doesn't work, you find another way to procure, to get whatever it is that you need. Now, my study looked at what are called variables, four main topics. And one of them was the German and Scandinavian states' offer of asylum to Syrians, but without providing legal means of transportation. So here you had a very generous offer by the German, Norwegian, and Swedish states that said, okay, Syrians, if you can come here, you can seek asylum. But there was no legal way to travel there. How did that impact and affect their decision to seek asylum? The experience of Syrians living under authoritative rule, where the legal system is often ineffectual and extra legal means are used ubiquitously to seek whatever it is that you wish to procure. And third, Syrians' lack of confidence in the application of international law. The Syrian revolution began in about 2011, and by 2012 there was already a problem with internally displaced people. By the end of 2012, refugees were already pouring out of Syria into the larger region, Lebanon, Turkey, and Jordan. And lastly, why did Syrians decide to stay within the region? Was it based on their belief that European states would not ensure their human rights, particularly religious freedoms, and were they just so frustrated by the lack of efficacy in international law to bring an end to the violence in Syria that they decided just to stay in the region? Now, the study is in 5 parts, and it was translated into Arabic. And the first part is the demographic section, age, name, gender. And the second section looks at how people view international law and what did they think of the UN's role, of the international law's role in the crisis that followed in 2015. The breakdown of participants, the majority were from the Netherlands, then Sweden, Norway, Turkey, Syria, Germany, Lebanon, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Egypt, Jordan, Poland, Italy, and Denmark. Again, I mentioned there is a link to the published conference brief that includes all of this charts that will lay out for you the actual individual, individual responses of the participants, showing you how they view each question. It was predominantly male because most of the refugees that went to Europe are male, and mostly young, born between 1985 and 2000, and all participants were born in Syria. A few others came by family unification, 15%, but 84% of the people surveyed did go through extra legal means. So some of the questions that are asked are how they view the UN, how they view international law. One of the things that the data shows is that the participants believed that international law really didn't help them and really didn't apply to them outside of Europe. But once they reached Europe and were inside the borders of a European country, that international law did help them. It was useful, but within those countries. 90% of the participants said that often in Syria, people have to go outside the law to gain access to life necessities to allow them to be upwardly mobile. So these two things affirm the thesis, the main thesis of my research, stating that the Syrians' exposure to historic authoritative rule in law not functioning and international law not applying to them outside the borders of Europe was a motivation for them to seek extra legal means to go to Europe. Now, this is not saying that I condemn or condone what occurred or an endorsement of anything that transpired or of human smuggling. This is just to point out why this occurred. Some of the motivation of why Syrians went by extra legal means, why they didn't wait for the UN, why they didn't wait for international law. They were already used to law not working for them since 2011, and they had a much longer history of understanding of what should be done when laws don't function anymore. And again, 90% of the participants said they left Syria because no one was coming to save them. They had to save themselves. Many of them left because they wanted to find jobs so that they could help their families within the region or to bring family members to through reunification. Interestingly, 100% of the people who stayed within the region say they stayed in the region because I did not feel I and or my family would be granted full human rights in European countries. Now, again, going back to why I feel that this type of research is important, you already see the lines being drawn here. International law doesn't apply to people outside of Europe, only within Europe. You had people remaining in the region because they didn't feel that they would or their family would receive all full human rights. And when policymakers ask questions like why did they come, I wanted to provide these answers, these very nuanced answers of why the refugees came, particularly from Syria. So again, if you look at the link in the comments, you'll see there's the link there to the published research. It's a very short read. It's mostly the data tables that are involved in that paper. And one thing that I didn't publish there was I had a lot of responses from the fill-in portion of the questionnaire. Many people said, we went to Europe because the Arab countries did not allow us to enter, and we went to Europe because he wanted to avoid death. The main cause of fleeing was the suffering of the Syrian people caused by the international community. One person said, Europe, thank you. One person responded, there is no such thing as law in Syria. There was corruption that is rooted in the state institutions. There is no state in Syria since Assad's father took power in 1970. So you had many people responding that they came to Europe because they were suffering, because they were dying, because they wanted to avoid killing innocent people, because they didn't want to be drafted into the Syrian army. They didn't believe in international law applying to them because they didn't see that happening. And they also had this long experience with the law not functioning within Syria. I hope this makes sense. It's a very complicated topic, and I hope that by doing these videos it makes this information more accessible to more people, because ultimately it's individual citizens contacting and lobbying their governments for change that makes change happen. When I was working in the field of policy, this is the only thing that made a change, where you give the general population, you arm them with this information of this is what's happening, and then they contact their representative. This is how change happens. We need to be engaged with our governments, with our representatives, and it starts at the local level. So I hope that we can use this information and benefit from it, and hopefully make positive change. Thank you.